I did not hit her. It's not true. It's bullshit. I did not hit her. I did not. Oh, hi, Mark.
No. That's the wrong room. No. Go back into your apartment. We're talking about Room, not The Room in this episode. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and in this episode, we are going to be a little somber, but there is some lightheartedness toward the end of the episode. So if you don't want to be bawling or have a bad taste in your mouth as we go, we get a little uncomfortable talking about heavy topics, and so, you know, we have a little fun, let's say. We have a little fun. Anyways, we are talking today about the film Room. Not The Room, as my little jokey intro cold open did, but Room, a 2015 film by Lenny Abramson, starring Brie Larson and Jacob Tremblay, among others like Joan Allen, Sean Bridgers, Tom McCamus, and William H. Macy. Main characters are Brie Larson and Jacob Tremblay. Phenomenal performance by those two. Brie Larson ended up winning the Best Actress Oscar for her role as Joy/Ma in this film. It is a tough film to watch, especially if you have kids, but I think a phenomenal film to look at just how far parents will go for their children, even if the world thinks that they are not doing it for the children or for, selfish reasons. We'll get into that a little bit in this movie. The movie was based on a book named Room by Emma Donoghue, which came out only like 5 years before the movie came out. Is a story told from the perspective of a 5-year-old boy named Jack, who Jacob Tremblay plays. And Emma Donoghue has said that she wrote this story because of the 5-year-old named Felix, who was a kid in the Fritzl case. Now, if you haven't heard of the Fritzl case, this was a case of quite crazy proportions. So the Fritzl case happened in Austria, and it came out in about 2008. And it turned out a woman named by the name of Elizabeth Fritzl had been held captive for 24 years by her father, Joseph Fritzl, who had assaulted her and imprisoned her with many other people, including 7 children. One died after birth, and people didn't know what was, and this happened in like the 70s and 80s, right? So we're talking about a 24-year-old period from, the 60s and the 70s, not the 70s and 80s. And in 2009, he pleaded guilty to all of the counts, even though he was a very, very old man by the time 2008 rolled around. And one of those children was Felix. And so Emma Donoghue based the story on him. And then it was that screenplay was adapted, and it was turned into the movie starring Brie Larson and Jacob Tremblay. Now, the things that we're going to discuss in this episode are pretty tough topics. So this is my first content warning, and I'm sure there will probably be more content warnings as we go through. This is information associated with kidnapping, sexual abuse, child abuse, and just like the massive mental health issues one would have even upon being freed from captivity, which is what happens in the film. Spoiler alert, it's not all about room. Now, in the movie, we spend most of our time with Jack, and we experience the world from his perspective. And throughout several parts of the movie, we do hear him narrating as well. So this is kind of like a story told by Jack as Jack is 5 years old. Like it's definitely from the mind of a 5-year-old, and it's a film that is difficult to stomach. And if you're like me or my guest, we were saying on Facebook that the film absolutely wrecked us, and my guest doesn't even have any children. So it's just like the nature of the content of the film and all of the nastiness of humans that it brings up, but also the triumph of humans as well. Like the movie ends on a positive note, which we'll discuss. But I just wanted to throw that out there for my loyal listeners who may not have seen this movie, maybe avoiding it for a particular set of reasons, and those reasons being the content of the movie. Some people may have read the book and decided, wow, that movie came out and I'm definitely not going to watch that movie. So just, be aware of that. Again, more content warnings. It was a really well-directed film. It's a good story, but it is a heart-wrenching story. So I'm not going to drone on and on about the content. Of course, we'll talk about it as we get in. So without further ado, let's jump into the discussion of the 2015 film Room. My guest host today is Dr. Chelsea Robertson. Chelsea received her Ph.D. in experimental psych from East Tennessee State University in 2021. She is currently an assistant professor of psychology at West Liberty University in Northern West Virginia, where she teaches a variety of courses, as one does, but primarily research methods, intro psych, and developmental psychology. Her professional interests include trauma-informed teaching and effective teaching practices in the post-secondary classroom. Chelsea, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, I am super happy to have you on. We just saw each other, as of this recording, a week ago today. We saw each other at the STP, the Society for the Teaching of Psychology's annual conference on teaching, which is referred to as ACT or ACT. I think for some folks, they like calling it ACT. I do not like calling it ACT, but it's ACT to me, STP ACT. So we just saw each other in Portland, and you ask, why didn't you record it in Portland, man? And I didn't have any microphones. So maybe next STP, next October, I can do an in-person recording of some description, but we'll see. The last time we did it with Jason at AP Reading, it wasn't that great. Not that Jason's not great. Not that Jason's not great. It was the recording situation that wasn't great. I need to be clear on that one, lest he never appears on the show again. Okay, so I'm happy to have you on, Chelsea. Good to see you again a week later.
I love how you don't have to give a last name with Jason. We just all kind of know who we're referring to at this point.
He's been on the second most number of times, so faithful listeners will know who I am talking about when I say Jason. Yes, absolutely. Those 5 people that listened to our chat at the AP Reading about Pulp Fiction. Yeah, those 5 people that listened to that one. They'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so before we jump into discussing this pretty difficult hardcore film, and not hardcore in the sense that people think of hardcore, but like, oh my God, heart-wrenching. I just wanted to get your thoughts, like I do with most of my guest hosts. What are your thoughts on film in general? And then if you do use film in your teaching, why this particular medium in your pedagogy?
So, admittedly, I'm still very much a very brand new professor. I'm going into, I'm actually in my third year of teaching right now.
Congratulations. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I am working on kind of expanding my toolbox in terms of the materials that I use in my assignments, in classrooms. I am really interested in kind of venturing into using films to teach just because I've actually been a fan of your podcast for many years. And so
thank you.
You might actually remember me being a kind of a totally normal person back when I met you back in Pittsburgh.
Yes.
And the Jason, who is now apparently on the same level of fame as Madonna.
Yes, or Prince. Yeah.
Or Prince, of course. When he introduced us, and I was like, oh my God, that is Alex Swan. I've listened to his podcast before. So I've been interested in using film, and so I've not quite used it yet, but I am slowly becoming interested in the idea. I'm slowly going into that territory. Like, I am definitely looking towards the near future of using film in some capacity. So
Excellent.
Kind of working on this podcast with you, I'm kind of like, okay, this may not be like the number one film that I choose, just as we're going to get into.
Yeah.
But I can definitely see this as being an option for me, certainly.
Okay. So then that leads me back to the broad question is, so since you've listened to the show before and now that you're on it, what about film and movies makes it a teaching tool that you want to use in your class, Sis?
Well, first, I think you would be very hard pressed to find a single film that couldn't be applied to psychology in some way.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm kind of quickly going through my mind of all of the films I've seen just in the past couple of years, and I'm coming up empty in terms of ones that I can't find one that doesn't immediately come to mind as, oh, well, I could bring this up in this class or in that class, or some sort of assignment that I could tie it to. You might have to squint for some of them to make it readily applicable for some students, but that's just kind of the magic of our field in general, but it's also the magic of film.
Yeah.
And then two, students are already going to be interested in film to begin with. And so it's kind of this natural gateway between, we want our students to be interested in psychology, and naturally they probably will be because of how applicable our field is. But then two, we have this natural medium to use. And so it's just kind of this natural way for us to bring students even in closer to the awesomeness of psychology.
I certainly agree with that. And that's one of my central points when I give this talk about how, using movies and other forms of digital picture media like TV shows as well into the classroom to broaden students' horizons. Although I will say a recent guest did mention that I don't know if we're possibly losing our student audience because of films requiring a certain level of attention for a given number of minutes. 80 plus, we'll say. Killers of the Flower Moon is coming out soon. As of this recording, it's probably already out by the time this podcast episode is published. And that movie's 3.5 hours, folks. And I don't know if our students would want to sit through that, but it's supposed to be really good adaptation of what happened in Oklahoma to the Osage people and the oil that they found in Oklahoma. So I'm really excited for that, but I don't know if students would be. So we might have to pivot, is what I'm saying. We might have to pivot. I will never not use movies in my classes, and even if they are kicking and screaming. Why is it so long, Dr. Swan? It's so long. It's not a minute. Okay, so let's move on to our chat for today, which is about the film Room. Just Room. Not to be confused with the cult classic The Room, which is Tommy Wiseau's amazing, god-awful film, right? Have you seen The Room, Chelsea?
No, but I have heard plenty of it.
Okay.
And so I feel like I have already seen The Room.
So this one's just called Room, and it came out in 2015. So before we jump into the site concepts that we spotted while watching this movie, Chelsea, why don't you explain to the listeners where you came to this choice? I know you offered a couple of suggestions, and I was like, you know what? I haven't seen Room. Let's do Room. So what was your thinking?
So really, there were two reasons why I came to this conclusion. First, this is just a really wonderfully made film. That was kind of number one on my list.
Yeah.
Number two was the bigger reason. I think when you have a film about trauma, it is very tempting for you to make the film entirely about trauma. Like, let's just dump in as much horrible stuff that we can.
Yeah.
And of course, this film is full of terrible stuff.
Yeah.
Like, you're not watching this film to feel good. I know you and I yesterday on Facebook, we were kind of joking, like, this was awful. Like, I know this is preparing to discuss this film. This wasn't the first time that I'd seen it.
Right.
And I even
it was the
had
first
to
time
take
I had seen it.
I had to take breaks watching it. And like, I knew what was coming, like with every scene. And so this film is full of some of the worst things that humans can experience, like, no doubt.
Right.
But one of the things that I really admire about the film is that it doesn't just swing the way of, okay, we're just going to focus entirely on all of these really terrible things that happen to people. But it's also not just full of this really ridiculous inspiration of, oh, but once you are out of these really terrible situations, look at how wonderful life is. It's, once you're out of trauma, everything's okay. You should be happy. Like, it really shows this really, it shows the complexity of what dealing with trauma, especially long-term, very complex trauma, can look like.
Right.
It shows the difference between a child growing up in a traumatic situation versus an adult who knows what life before that traumatic situation looks like. It shows a very accurate portrayal, I think. And it doesn't paint it one way or another. It's not entirely bleak. It's not entirely hopeful and like a toxic positivity. It's not a toxic negativity. It's very much, it's right there, right in the middle. And I kind of like that.
Right. It feels human. It feels like a human story. And as you mentioned, we were talking about it on Facebook, and a lot of other people jumped in and said that they read the book, and they said the book was phenomenal. And some said that they watched the movie, and then others were like, I read the book and I think that was enough. And I think it goes to show that if the book was wonderful and the adaptation from the book to the movie works, then I think you have a good film on your hands. And that is what makes the experience of the trauma no less difficult, of course, as a viewer, but you also don't feel the nihilistic bleakness of these characters' lives. Like the movie ends on a very high note, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So
absolutely.
Yeah. And so while it was difficult to watch, and I'll just repeat my content warning here, is that we're going to be talking about some pretty gnarly things as we reference events in the film. I'm going to start with the summary, of course, but we've got lovely Jack, the child in the film, played by Jacob Tremblay, who made a wonderful little dude at the Oscars in February of 2016 when Brie Larson won the Oscar for Best Actress. He was amazing on the red carpet and hanging out with all of these old actors and stuff. And so you see that spark from that kid, and I think that makes the movie worthwhile. So I'm not going to go into too many details when I do this summary, just to give the listener a little bit of a lay of the land. If you have not read the book, not seen the film, and kind of want to go into the movie with a little bit of a handhold, would you say a handhold is a good way to put it, Chelsea?
I think so.
Yeah. So the movie is about two characters. One named Ma, although we find out her name is Joy later in the film. And she is the mother to Jack. And the film starts with him turning 5 years old, and they live in a room. The room is a shed in some guy's backyard. And we come to learn throughout the movie that Ma was kidnapped and essentially forced to be a sex partner. One of those sexual encounters with her captor produced Jack 5 years prior. 5 years and 9 months, I suppose, prior.
Do you remember how Alice wasn't always in Wonderland?
She fell down deep in a hole.
Right, well, I wasn't always in room. I'm like Alice. I was a little girl named Joy.
Nah.
And I lived in a house with my mom and my dad. You would call them Grandma and Grandpa.
What house?
A house. It was in the world. And there was a backyard, and we had a hammock. And we would swing in the hammock, and we would eat ice cream.
A TV house?
No, Jack, a real house, not TV. Are you even listening to me? When I was a little older, when I was 17, I was walking home from
Where
school.
was I?
You were still up in heaven. But there was a guy, he pretended that his dog was
What
sick.
guy?
Old Nick. We call him Old Nick. I don't know what his real name is. But he pretended his dog was sick.
What's the dog's name?
Jack, there wasn't a dog. He was trying to trick me. Okay? There wasn't a dog. Old Nick stole me.
I want a different story.
No, this is the story that you get. He put me in his garden shed. Here. Room is the shed.
The first part of the movie, I would say about the first hour, is them in their room, which they refer to as just room. No article, no definite article. So it's just room. And they don't have a lot of definite articles for a lot of things in the room. They have skylight. They have closet or wardrobe. I'm sorry. They have wardrobe. They're from England, apparently. They have wardrobe and a few other things here and there that are slipping my mind. I didn't write them all down, but the definite article is lost. They also have TV, which provides them with some form of entertainment beyond books. Their captor, referred to as Old Nick, we don't actually know his real name. Because Ma is very protective of Jack, knowing that. And much of the film is seen from his perspective, which I also very much enjoy. The director, Lenny Abramson, did a phenomenal job capturing various perspectives with the camera to be Jack is wonderful filmmaking. And so the first half of the movie is them in this room and their lives and all of the stuff that happens. Old Nick comes by every evening and he gives supplies, but then he also gets sex. And then later, probably the second half of the movie, will say they try to hatch an escape plan. Their first go at it doesn't work. I'm not going to go into the details on this because we can either do that with the psych segments, or we can just leave it to you to read or to watch. So their first plan doesn't work, but then their second plan works, except with some hitches, but eventually works. Joy/Ma is eventually freed. They are taken to the hospital. Old Nick is arrested, and all of this. We meet Joy's parents. Her mother, Grandma, is played by Joan Allen, which was she was phenomenal in this role as well. Her parents are divorced, but we meet his mother, played by his father, William H. Macy. And then what I assume, although it's not stated, what I assume is Grandma's new fling, which was actually a family friend, Leo, as her new, I guess, live-in partner. We'll just say partner.
Mhm.
And so the second half of the film explores their recovery, Jack and Ma's recovery. So that's the synopsis that I'm going to give without too many details. And of course, we're going to go into the details in our two segments. So what I'm thinking, Chelsea, is we've got two things that I think you can help explain to our listeners here. The first segment, I think, is just looking at this from a child development lens, right? Because you have experience in child development and you teach developmental psychology. So we'll do that, and we'll talk about how Jack grows through 5 years old in only room. He spends the first 5 years of his life only in this, 8x8 room. And then after our break, we'll talk about the trauma part. Okay, Chelsea, I've got something for you here. I've got a question for you. What kind of child development milestones did you spot in this movie with respect to Jack? Like, what are some of the things that we get clued into as the audience about his development through his first 5 years?
So the first thing that comes to mind is I'm immediately drawn to his cognitive development. He is very much aware of certain things in the world around him. Like he's a very bright kid for what is going on in room. Ma has done a very great job of doing what she can to support his development in room. We see her reading to him. We see his drawings and coloring on the wall. We see him engaging in track. I think that she has almost like a routine set up for him. Like he does track, running from one wall to the next. I love that scene where she's almost like messing with him.
Yeah,
like,
I said that wall. I said that wall.
Yeah, I love that scene. But cognitively, we as the audience know he only can cognitively be aware of what he's been exposed to in room. He believes that what he sees on TV is real, but only in the extent of what he actually can view on TV. He cannot comprehend that there's a life outside of the however many walls that room has.
4.
It's 4.
Yeah, that's what it. Yeah, I believe it's 4.
Okay, it's 4. It's not a very fancy shack, I guess. we even see things in terms of his language development. There's a couple of little quirks in his language that happen. We can kind of maybe attribute that to maybe Ma's exposure. Like, he's only been exposed to Ma's language. He's not grown up around other children. He's only been exposed to Ma's language. We know that I keep on going back to the whole TV thing. He really believes in this whole idea of magic, which, of course, when we're thinking about a 5-year-old kid, like, that's very normal development.
Right.
Like, we have to keep in mind that he's still a very little kid. We're not going to expect him to have the same cognitive abilities as, a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old.
Right.
He really doesn't understand anything about the outside world, but can we really blame him at that point? He's
No.
only known room.
Right. He's only known room. And just to give a little bit more background to what I said in the introduction, which was, this is based on the Fritzl case, which was a 2008 like true crime situation in Austria, where a woman was held for 24 years and birthed 7 children, one of those being a little boy named Felix. And Felix is what caught the attention of the writer of the book, who Emma Donoghue, which got a bunch of accolades and everything like that. But she was most impressed by 5-year-old Felix from this case. And this like found out in 2008, right? This is a woman who was held captive for 24 years in up to, recent history, we'll say. And, you've got this little boy Felix, and I'm wondering what, like, because we can compare this to some other cases that have been in the literature. So the children that were recently found chained up in a basement. Hey, I don't know the details of this one. That's the only thing that stands out to me right now. Children. Now, there wasn't any adults chained up in the basement. It was the parents chaining up the children. I think it may be in Pennsylvania. I don't know. I can't remember that. I was struggling to get those details to be able to like search for it. And then we have, a situation like Jeannie, for example, the child who never learned how to speak, and then passed that critical period, and it was very difficult for her to speak even as a growing child into an adult, right? So we have some of these instances, and I'm going to pause here, mention that Ma in this story, which is, a fictionalized story of possibly true events or like true ideas, right? Ma gets some flack later in the movie about whether or not, raising Jack in the in room was the best thing for him. And I got to say, she did a phenomenal job. And that interviewer was a piece of shit. We swear rarely on this show, but I feel very strongly about the questions that were asked of this character and the consequences that those questions had. And I gotta say, even you might disagree about, her raising a kid inside of a room, an 8x8 shell, and never seeing anything. But now this is the thing where it's hard to separate the fact of the movie, the internal logic and consistency of the movie, and then Jacob Tremblay as a real person who did not get raised in a room, right? So Jacob Tremblay's trying to be this character. And I'm sure he got a ton of direction on like, this is how you should be acting right now. This is what you would be saying in these circumstances. But it's still hard to separate Jacob Tremblay out of that situation as somebody who does know, right? And so one of the things for me as I was watching this, and this is both a blessing and a curse when I watch movies now, especially when I watch movies specifically for the show, is that how much of the cognitive development that we see in Jack the character would actually be real life in that
Yes.
situation. And of course, wildly unethical to actually do anything about that.
Yes.
And so it's always going to be an open question until somebody has the exact specific circumstances to the movie. And so I'm just every time I saw him do something that was so amazing, I was like, props to Ma, man. Props to Ma. She taught him how to read, and he was reading all by himself at 5 years old.
And he was reading some kind of difficult text. I mean, he was reading Alice in Wonderland. I mean, it wasn't your run-of-the-mill standard stuff that you would typically see a 5-year-old kid reading. I mean,
C-Spot Run. Yeah.
Right. It wasn't like the Canterbury Tales or anything, but like, I mean, it was some pretty challenging stuff. Like this kid, he was bright.
Yeah.
Like, and you can see that throughout the film.
And you know, the routine and everything, solid parenting, telling him, you know, about his circumstances in a way that he would understand. But then also one of the ways that she connected with him before he turned 5 was telling white lies about their circumstances and why their circumstances were the way they were. And then when he turned 5 and she saw how precocious he was and how outgoing and bright he was, she was like, all right, this is our only chance for you to have a semi-decent life. I got to tell you the truth. And she tells him the truth, and he gets mad at her. And I think he gets mad at her in a very developmentally appropriate way. Having had 2 children who have been 5, developmentally appropriate anger at him, at her just pulling the wool from his eyes.
Yeah, he's like, you've told me one thing all my life, and now you're suddenly changing the script on me. That is not cool, Ma. And he's pretty upset about the whole thing. But then Ma's whole reasoning is, I'm seeing a shot here, and I know you're going to be really mad at me. And she's like, I know, Jack, I know that I've told you one thing, and I know that I've been telling you lies all your life, but this is our shot here. I keep on thinking back to the scene when it's kind of showing the flashbacks of their routine about how they got to practice the screaming to the aliens. Like that was a developmentally appropriate way of, you know, regularly maybe trying to get someone to hear them.
Right.
But she can't say, oh, hey, we're actually captive in here. It's a way to get Jack to help her maybe get some help in a developmentally appropriate way. But now she's trying to get him on board. And yeah, she's doing it in a really good way. Like she understands how to get him on board. So I'm just, again, like we have to understand it's fiction and like these are actors here, but like beyond all of that, like the developmentally appropriateness of how Ma interacts with Jack at every single stage here, even when their interactions are not entirely like fluid, like when they are arguing, when things are not going well between them, it is still very accurate. And I still just want to say, good job, Mom. Like you're doing the best that you can.
Yeah. And even when they get out of their crappy situation, to put it mildly, she obviously feels guilty. Ma feels guilty. Ma struggles with the repercussions of her actions, not only in raising Jack by herself in a room, but also what happens to her family, what happens to all of her friends. And she feels guilty, and she feels, I would say, a lot of shame, especially for the Jack stuff, guilty for the parent stuff, and doesn't get any kind of hunky-doriness back from everyone in her life. I think Leo's the only one who really just is like, you know what, I'm not going to get involved. I'm just going to hang out with Jack. But she feels that guilt because she's like, I've been gone for 7 years. You guys got divorced. Her dad won't even look at Jack in one scene. And she's like, you guys can't give me just a little bit? Just a little bit? And I think that's very true to life, by the way. Everyone's got their own stuff. And most people aren't just going to give up that stuff for the sake of somebody else's bigger stuff. If that makes sense.
He needs to play with something real. I'm worried about him being on the phone.
He's doing fine.
Well, I don't give him my phone, so I'd appreciate it if you didn't give him yours.
Okay, well.
Great. I just want him to connect with something.
Joy. Joy. He's really doing fine.
I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm supposed to be happy.
You just need to rest, okay?
No, I don't. I don't need to rest.
That's what the doctor
That is not what the doctor said. You don't know what he said because it was a confidential conversation and you don't know what he said.
All right. I feel like you're impossible to talk to right now.
Oh, sorry.
Well, no, you're not sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sorry. You have no idea what's going on in my head.
Yeah, well, try me. I have asked you.
And then what? Then every time you look at me, that's all that you see?
When I look at you, Joy, I will see my daughter.
You don't need me. You've been doing just fine without me.
How can you say that? Huh? Do you think that you were the only one whose life was destroyed?
Actually, that's exactly what I think.
Yeah, how would you feel if somebody took Jack away from you?
Oh, shut up!
Go easy.
Look at him! You should be thinking about him!
Don't you tell me how to look after my son. I'm sorry that I'm not nice anymore. But you know what, maybe? If your voice saying be nice hadn't been in my head, then maybe I wouldn't have helped the guy with the f***ing sick dog!
Yeah, where she's talking to her mom and she's like, or her mother, like the grandma, is saying, do you think that you're the only one who went through things?
Mhm.
And Joy / Ma, she's like, yeah. She's like, you kind of expect her to be like, do you think that what I went through was nothing? Like, I kind of wanted her to like almost explode on grandma, to be like, yeah, I know that you lost a daughter, but do you know what I went through? Like,
Yeah.
It's like
You got to
want
have-
to,
I
you
think
got to have a life.
Yeah, she got to have a life. I know it was not a very good life. We're kind of bleeding into trauma here, but this is the last thing that I will say about that. It's like, you got to have me in a hospital. I'd have Jack in my room as a captive. I didn't get to go to the hospital.
I had to have old Nick.
Yeah, I'd have old Nick helping me deliver a baby that I don't want him to have. Okay, so let's get back to some of the development things. So again, Jack has developmentally appropriate anger and joy and fascination, which I think is amazing considering that his entire life up till then was just a room. Now you can argue that maybe like the first year kind of doesn't really count because, you know, babies and infants are pretty easily, newborns sleep a lot. Infants are easily distracted. And then once you get to toddler stage, then you can kind of start ramping stuff up and, you know, making things work a little bit more for you. But even then, oh man, Joy was by herself. Okay, going into trauma still, a little too much. All right. So when he turns 5 at the beginning of the movie, he gets upset that he doesn't have any candles. And of course, old Nick doesn't allow his captive to have fire. Which I think is kind of interesting because she probably could have taken that toaster and held it up to that like cork, the sound dampening stuff, and just like kind of gently started chipping it away. Like there were a lot of things that she could have done without fire. Although one thing that you could have also done with that toaster is lit candles. I'm just saying, like that stuff. I don't know if you've ever touched a toaster, but that stuff gets hot.
True.
Yeah. Anyways, this is a little inconsistency that I noticed. But and, she was captive and didn't know what old Nick would do to her. So it makes a lot of sense. She could have gotten murdered and then old Nick would have just abducted another teenager. Although the backstory in the book, which isn't really mentioned in the movie, is that his house is getting foreclosed on. So
Interesting.
he's struggling because he didn't have a job. So they have an argument about jobs and money in the movie. But yeah, he's losing the house. So of course he's losing.
If he loses the house, then he loses room.
Yeah. And so I think so we don't really get the reason why it's now or never for Ma in this
Right.
particular like escape plan. But it is because like he loses power, or he loses his job, he loses power, right? You kind of think, oh, he's punishing them for turning off for like, doing stuff in the room that they shouldn't be doing. But it turns out that no, he can't pay his bills. Which I think is quite interesting backstory. Not necessary for the emotional oomph of the movie, but I just thought that was an interesting tidbit from the book that did not make it into the movie. The impetus as to why they have to escape when they do. So, were there any other kinds of developmental things that you see maybe after they get out of room?
Something that I really liked in the movie was when Jack escapes, when he is out in the real world for the first time and he is in the back of old Nick's truck and he has gotten out of the rug and he sees the sky for the first time. He has seen the sky throughout his life through skylight, but he has never seen the sky purely before. And it's just, I think this is one of my most favorite scenes in the movie. He just has this look of like amazement on his face. Just, I mean, props to Jacob Tremblay for how he portrayed this look of amazement, being such a young actor. You know that he's on a mission, but he takes a couple of seconds just to look up at the sky and he's in pure awe. He's like, oh my goodness, like there is a world out here. And then he's almost like, okay, I've got to do what Ma told me to do. Like he got out of the rug. He's got to wait until the truck stops. He's got to get out of the truck. He's got to find someone to get help. And the fact that he's so young and he's able to keep everything in mind, he's able to stay calm enough to do this. I don't think I could do this. And I'm much older.
Right?
I'm much older than Jack. And I've like been in the outside world. And so I'm again just amazed at how cognitively and socially, emotionally, just mature Jack is throughout the whole film. But that scene in particular, like the music that's playing in the background, it's a very powerful scene. I love it.
It really is. And I will add to that bit is that he is able to remember how many stops and turns in that particular sequence. And it's just like, not only was he amazed at seeing the sky for real for the first time, that's one, right? That overwhelming awe is what I will say. And then he has to remember the plan itself once he's been unfurled, okay? He's got a note in his hand and his pocket that he needs to get to a stranger. And then 3, able to recall when prompted by a police officer where he was found in relation to where he started. That is amazing. I don't know if I honestly don't know if my kids could do that when they
No,
were
it was
5.
very amazing. Like the police officer, like the I know that the officer who was kind of driving, he was like, "No, I think that the kid just needs to sleep. Like he's obviously he needs to just rest. Like he's not going to be able to tell you anything." But she's like, "No, he just give him a minute. He's trying to remember it." And she's slowly just yanking this information out of him, and talking in uh he's talking kind of like in child speak
Mhm.
almost. It's like unless you've been around children that small, you probably would have just been like, "Oh, he's just we're never going to figure out what he's saying." But
Yeah.
then you see it click on her face like, "I know exactly where he's talking about."
Mhm.
And you're just like, "Oh, thank goodness." Like you kind of feel this deep sense of relief like, "Okay, Jack finally remembers," or like Jack has finally been able to communicate where Ma is.
Mhm.
And it's amazing how he's able to communicate and how she's able to understand what he's trying to communicate.
Yeah, that's it. It is a great sequence of events, and I think the final thing that you spotted when to do with his development is what's the future like for his development, right? And so, he was raised inside of a room. The only light was either artificial or from skylight, right? And
Mhm.
so, what did they have to do to assist him with adjusting to this new world?
Yeah, so at the hospital, the doctor just keeps on taking stuff out of his white coat pockets. They're like, "Here's some sunglasses for both of you." They give Jack a mask. They give him, um, they tell him like he's not used to germs.
Yeah.
Jack, whenever he goes outside, he's always covering his ears. And you just think about all of the sensory stuff that he's never been around before. He's going to have to wear sunscreen because, I mean, he had skylight, but how much UV exposure did he actually have? Probably not a whole lot.
Yeah.
And so it's not even just like the social aspect of what he missed growing up in room. It's quite literally the physical aspect, the germs, the sound exposure, the light exposure, um, everything else that we kind of take for granted in a
Mhm.
lot of ways too.
Yeah. It reminds me of the study that I tell my sensory. It reminds me of the study that I tell my sensation and perception students when we are talking about vision development, and how these researchers took some cats and they raised them in cylinders with mirrors at the top and the bottom, and they either had horizontal lines or vertical line gradients, so in between black and white. And that's how they were reared, right? So as kittens placed into these cylinders that are endless, either endless vertical lines or endless horizontal lines, because of the mirrors, and what that did to their vision and whether or not they could see the opposite orientation of lines when tested as they grew older. And it's just like, oh my gosh, Jack probably has never had his pupils so constricted ever, unless he was staring directly at a light source in a dark room, right? His pupils probably were always big because of
Mhm.
how dim and stuff that was. And so to go outside and have his physiology never adapted to being in actual sunlight is just wild to me. And he takes it all in stride too. I think that is something to note as we end this segment, is that for much of the movie, except for his anger outbursts, he takes a lot of it in stride. And kudos to this fictional boy for the ability to take everything in stride, because I don't know if I could do that. You've mentioned that you probably wouldn't have been able to find your way back. or tell the police that's what they need to do. I don't. I've met my kids. I don't know about that. Although, as we talk about as we're going to talk about in our next segment, trauma really does change the way that our brains develop. And I'll end with this as far as development goes. The doctor says a very important line in the movie to Ma when they're in the hospital. And she said, "It's really good that you got him out while his brain is still plastic." And that is incredibly important for the second half of the movie as we see him adjust to the outside. So we will take a quick break and we will talk more Room. Stay tuned for that trauma segment. Are you a big fan of the Cinema Psych podcast? A connoisseur of the compelling stories and intriguing insights that we have on this show? Well, show your love in style with our premium podcast merchandise. Yeah, that's right. I've updated the podcast store from ultra comfy hoodies, perfect for cozy podcast binges, to sleek coffee mugs that add a dash of personality to your morning routine. Our merchandise store has it all. I've added so many new products, and it's designed to withstand countless listening marathons. There are a lot of episodes. I think you'll love them. But wait, there is more. Every week, there is a new promotion, turning up the volume on value. So keep an eye out for our exciting special promotions. Every other week, 15% off. In between, sometimes there's a special 25% off day. And then sometimes there's free shipping. It's the perfect way to score your Cinema Psych podcast merch for less. I'm excited to have expanded the merchandise offerings, but I'm really excited to say that new designs are coming up. And you can put these designs on all of the merchandise. So keep an eye out for new arrivals in the design section. So don't just listen, wear it, flaunt it, live it. Visit our merchandise store at cinemapsychpod.swanpsych.com/store to shop your love for the Cinema Psych podcast today. Remember, every purchase goes directly to supporting this show. And of course, thanks for listening to this show. I love doing it. Now let's get back into it. And we are back with Dr. Chelsea Robertson talking Room, 2015 film starring Brie Larson and Jacob Tremblay as a mother and son who escape a really bad time with a kidnapper turned sexual predator turned, hopefully, defendant and prisoner, right? We don't know his fate at the end of the movie, but we're hoping there's no plea deal, as Joy's or Ma says, as Joy's father says, excuse me. Wow, no pleas, no pleas. We don't want any pleas, is what Philliam H. Muffman says. If you're not aware, that's his portmanteau with his wife, Felicity Huffman. Philliam H. Muffman. Anyways, let's talk trauma. I am uncomfortable, and so there are a lot of jokes, and that's where you got that one from. It's because the trauma in this movie is very, very difficult to not only watch, but read, explore, write about, all of it, which is why I'm not a trauma researcher. But we have one with us. Chelsea, please take us through, I think what we had said was that we're going to do Jack's trauma first, and then we'll talk about joys, which I think is the more visceral, because most people watching this movie are going to be adults, and we relate to that experience in some ways as being the same age. So what kinds of impacts does this experience have on Jack?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think that Jack has a really unique situation going on. I think that that's a really big understatement if we have to put it in a very simple summary. Mainly because Jack doesn't have anything to compare life outside of room to.
Right.
He grew up in room, and so he doesn't know that growing up in room is odd or that it is traumatic. Like us as the viewer, we're like, oh my God, like this is terrible. Like this is the very definition of child abuse.
Right.
Like this is the very definition of what you should not be doing to a child. But Jack, like he's growing up and we see him right off the bat. He's very happy. And it's almost like this very stark contrast between we're almost uncomfortable with the fact that he's this normal kid, right? Like we were talking about in the previous segment, like we see him doing all of these normal kid things, like for goodness sake, like he has a birthday party or
and a cake.
And a cake. Like he's celebrating with his mom his birthday at the very start of the film. But we do have to understand that this is trauma, like in terms of how trauma researchers would define this. Something that we also brought up in the previous segment, towards the end of the segment, was when Jack and Ma are in the hospital, the doctor brings up that very important quote. The most important thing you did was get him out while he's still plastic. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, yeah, there we go.
Exactly.
And I love how Jack takes that quote very literally. He kind of leans over to Ma and he's like very concerned. He's like, but I'm not plastic.
I love it too.
He responds in a way that is very normal for a 5-year-old kid to respond.
Indeed.
But us as psychologists, we know that we're not talking about like the material plastic. We're talking about in terms of neuroplasticity, and we're talking about the brain's ability to basically rebound and recover from an experience such as this, such as the one that Jack is growing up in. In terms of Jack's experience of growing up in room, we know that, and this is essentially what the doctor was talking about, because he got out when he did, his outlook is very good. We also know that the fact that he had Ma, who was obviously a very good mother, despite what that jerk of an interviewer was insinuating during that train wreck of an interview.
Right.
We know that he's going to have a rough road. We know that any sort of exposure to early trauma is going to be any exposure is going to be bad. But we know that the fact that Jack is very young and the fact that he is plastic, we know that his brain still has a lot of developing left to do. He's going to be okay. Like we are left with very good hope that he's still going to have a rough road, but it's going to be okay for Jack. And so that's kind of the synopsis of what we're working on with Jack.
One thing I wanted to note is in the memory literature, it's a common refrain to see the idea that we tend to not remember most of the things that happened to us, before the age of 4 or 5, because a lot of that stuff gets pruned in the development, and we don't need those memories anymore. And so the brain is like, that connection's worthless now. Like, I don't need to worry about this, that, or the other thing because that's not going to impact my survival anymore. But we also know that trauma does change the way that, and traumatic experiences, I should say, like, at this point, big T trauma rather than little T traumas here and there, right? So he's got a big T trauma, but as you say, like, he seems rather well adjusted to his life in that specific place. So how much of his pruning is going to be affected by what is then later told to him as a trauma, and how much of that is then going to, or how much has that impacted his brain development later down the road, right? So it's sort of an open question about how much he will actually remember from his time in room. And it will be most likely contingent on people telling him what happened and exploring like various memories from other people. And of course, the only other person that's really going to be able to tell him what actually happened in the room is Ma. And so we may not see explicit, let's say Jack at 15, right? Jack at 25, when the brain is done developing, right? It's done forming the connections in the frontal lobe. So how much impact did Room have on that? So we could see Jack at 15, we could see Jack at 25, and see whether or not any of those latent things will come up, right? If these are going to appear as an anxiety disorder, maybe, or psychosis in some way, right? We don't really know what his prognosis is because we don't know the interplay between memory and the trauma rewiring. So, oh man, I wish we could see. I wish they did, an epilogue or something. But of course, that would take away from the emotional impact of the movie. So maybe not. I don't know. I'm torn. The psychologist in me wants to know.
I know. Me too. Yeah, the whole linking between, he's very young and he may not remember as much as we would think he would remember. Because we're thinking, oh, of course he would remember like all of the very dramatic things that we saw in the film. But as psychologists, we know the younger you are, the less likely you are to remember things. Like we know infantile amnesia. We know that that's a thing. But we also know big T trauma affects the brain. We know that high glucocorticoid receptor areas are really quite affected by trauma. We know the limbic system. We know the prefrontal cortex. We know all of those things. Like that is heavily steeped in research. And so I would be very interested in seeing, does Jack go on to develop some form of psychopathology? I would be very interested in that, especially knowing that we already kind of see that in Joy a little bit. I know that's kind of encroaching on Joy's trauma a little bit, but we know that has a strong biological connection.
And the trauma that she was under both mentally and physically at his conception, his gestation, and his birth is also going to play a role in his biology, right? Good old genetics, but then also epigenetics.
100%. Yeah, prenatal stress is a huge predictor of a lot of psychopathology.
Right.
And so even if it's not affecting Jack now, it could be affecting him, decades down the road. That's it's really cool when we start thinking about the interplay between environment and genetics, but it's kind of scary to think about as well. That's kind of why I hate saying this, but like I love talking about trauma. Like I hate that we have to talk about it.
Yeah.
But I think that this is just a very fascinating field because there is so much interplay between all of these different topics that we get to talk about.
Yeah, and while it's hard to know what's going to happen to Jack because of prenatal stress, and although he had a relatively well-adjusted 5 years of his life. I think he is in, as you said at the start, his prognosis is good, regardless of his maybe future psychopathology, because he is a known case, right?
Yes.
He's going to have a team of doctors. He's going to have help all throughout his life. And we know that kind of social support, not just from his loved ones and family, Ma, his grandma, and everyone, and Leo. gotta put Leo in there. Seamus.
And Seamus.
Seamus, of course. Seamus is the dog, for those of you who don't know. He's going to have a lot of help, and that's going to impact his recovery. It's if he ends up in some side of psychosis or something, it's going to help his recovery. If he ends up with a debilitating anxiety disorder, he's going to have that team around him to assist with that behavioral cognitive therapy, all of that. He's a known case. A lot of the issues that we see in clinical psychopathology is that people are unaware of their family history or epigenetics associated with their ancestors. And so they don't know that maybe schizophrenia runs in their family, which is, heavily genetic. And so they end up having their first psychotic episode and don't think anything of it. They don't do anything about it. And then they get worse and they get worse and they get worse. And so these people tend to fall through the cracks. But Jack would hopefully not fall through the cracks because he is a known case.
Yeah, I would hope that with Jack, even if it's not him, a loved one would know something starts to show up in him, or he starts feeling a little not quite like himself, or just something goes awry with how he's feeling. That's already kind of signaling something. It's not trying to say that he's like a psychologist or like he's any sort of that means, but like he's already going to somehow be introduced to the mental health care system.
Yeah.
And so he's already going to have that connection. And so he's already going to see, okay, well, I need to get a checkup or something, like a mental health care checkup.
Yeah.
Fingers
crossed that happens. Yeah.
I would be hopeful. I would hope that is what would happen with Jack.
Sometimes I miss it.
Wasn't it awfully small?
It went every direction, all the way to the end. It never finished. And Ma was always there. But it was smaller in wardrobe.
What did you do in wardrobe?
Sleep. When old Nick came. I want to see Ma.
Yeah, I know. She's, she just needs to be on her own for a little while.
Jack? Someone here would like to meet you.
Jack. Here, let me get this for you. Come on. Let's go see.
Jack? Meet Seamus. Would you like to pet him?
So let's transition here to some of the more palatable. I've left this to the end, so if you've listened to us through this and you're just like, I can't deal with this next bit of discussion, then you can skip to the end. See, that's how we do it in the biz. That's post-production, baby, and pre-production, I guess. So Joy, Ma, she has the most palatable, visceral trauma that we see. So explain to the listeners, Chelsea, what kinds of signs that in the movie that speak to Joy's trauma.
Well, there's a lot. Right at the beginning of the film, one thing that it isn't the biggest thing that you see, but one that really stuck out to me was you just see this very blank, like flat affect on her face. You see this very like distant, like 1,000-yard stare
Mm-hmm.
on her face. Not necessarily when she's engaging with Jack, but it's always when he's focused on something and she's kind of watching him. So
Yeah.
you kind of see this very just, she's kind of barely having it together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like a very minor sign, but it's one that you see right off the bat, like within a couple of minutes of the film, if not a couple of seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Something that you see in Jack's point of view, you see in I forget like how far in the film it is, but one day Jack wakes up and he tries to wake up his mom. He tries to wake up Ma, and he's kind of noticing like she's not getting out of bed. And so he gets up and he's kind of occupying himself. He makes breakfast. He just kind of hangs out, and you hear the like over like the him like narrating,
Mm-hmm.
and he's like, oh, like Ma's having a gone day.
Mm-hmm.
And so those of us in psych, we were kind of like, oh, well, that's kind of like a clear sign of depression,
Mhm.
right? And so that's all happening in room. And then after the rescue of Ma and Jack, that's where we really see the complexity of Ma's reaction to all of the trauma that she's experienced. Like we see a lot of the very deep set depression that
Mhm.
she's experiencing in room, but it's like as soon as they get rescued, it becomes a lot more complex.
Yeah.
Like, of course, she's relieved to be out of that situation,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like now she's really coming to grips with what all she really experienced in room.
Yeah.
So now she's dealing with the depression. She has a lot of anger. She has a lot of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And so she has anger. Like she's very angry at her father
Mm-hmm.
for not even looking at Jack.
Right.
She's angry looking through old pictures from when she was in high school. She's sitting in her old bedroom with Jack, and she's like showing Jack a picture, and she's naming some of her old friends, and she
Mhm.
says, you know what happened to them? Nothing. They lived their life and nothing happened. And she kind of slams the book and she shuts the box or whatever she did.
Mm-hmm.
It's like she's angry. She's like, nothing happened to them, but something happened to me, and I'm like really pissed about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She's really angry at her mom for suggesting that she rest, and she's like, I've done nothing but rest. And her mom insinuates like she needs to be nice, and she has the quote, I'm sorry I'm not nice anymore, but maybe if your voice saying be nice hadn't been in my head, then maybe I wouldn't have helped the guy with the sick dog.
Yeah. So
And
let's
so
remind everyone that she was a captive for 7 years, 2 years by herself. She was a teenager when she was abducted. And that's because old Nick came up to her and said, "Oh, can you help me? My dog is sick." And it turns out that there was no dog, right? Can't have a sick dog if you don't have a dog. And he immediately tossed her into this room. And of course, if this room was like this and he knew what was happening in this room, what he was gonna do with this room, putting up all of the sound absorbers and the magnetic door lock with a code that only he knew, he probably did this to other girls.
Mhm. And so Joy, she's mad at her mother,
for
and
this
kind
be
of
nice in
rightfully
her head.
so. And it's like you can see the look of guilt on her mom's face. And I can only imagine what it's like to be the mother in that situation and being like, I mean, telling your child to be nice isn't a bad message. I mean, any decent parent would be like, yeah, you should be a nice person.
Yeah.
But
Be kind.
knowing that messaging ended up having your child be being taken from you for 7 years.
This movie, I'm gonna say it is a love letter to stranger danger. I'm on the record for that. You can put that to print. This is a love letter from Emma Donahue to stranger danger. You grew up with stranger danger, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did.
Be nice, but strangers are not to be trusted.
Be nice, but from a distance.
Exactly. You can say, hi, how are you doing?
And know
I'm
how to
gonna go
throw
this
a punch.
way.
Know how to throw a right hook.
Exactly. Yeah. Be able to knock someone down. Although, this is what I'm going to teach my children. Always aim for the nuts. And I'll tell you why. Not only does it hurt, I can speak from experience, but...
Is there something you would like to share?
But that's what one of the first things they teach you in Krav Maga, which is Israeli self-defense, is the front kick to the nards. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what they teach. And I'm not joking about that. That was the first thing I learned in a mix, a co-ed Israeli self-defense class, is front kick straight up. This is true. I'm showing Chelsea this through our videos. My Krav Maga master was like, it is a triangle, and if you hit any sides of the triangle on the way up, all you have to do is have that enough thrust from your hip, and it will find its target regardless.
Good to know.
It's like if the skee ball came to a triangle, right? And the ball is bouncing off the sides. She's laughing, but it's true. It comes to a point. Always kick there, right? You don't even need to learn how to throw a punch, because sometimes punches hurt. I also know this from experience. You can break your hand if you punch somebody in the face. It is unlikely you will break your foot in somebody's crotch. Just saying. Anyways, love letter to stranger danger. This is what happens when I'm uncomfortable. Okay.
I think you're very uncomfortable.
that was a comedy routine right there. That was a stand-up bit.
Ski ball to the nards.
Ski ball. Yep. Your foot is the ball, and then it hits the ball. The analogy is lost, but it's a triangle. That's all you need to remember. Your legs form a triangle. Okay. All right. So back to the serious stuff. Back
to drama.
Yeah. So Joy has this really gnarly interview after being pushed into it, by the way. Like, her lawyer, everybody is like, you should do this. There'll be money in it because, I'm not working pro bono for you anymore. I was like, oh my God. At least somebody set up a fund. Where's GoFundMe? They should, if this was really America in this movie, okay, maybe another stand-up bit. If this was really America in this movie, there would have been a GoFundMe, and they would have made hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for agreeing with me, because that is exactly how we handle stuff in this country. You don't get help from any organizations or anything like that. No, it's we survive with the subsistence of strangers. But of course, they are being strangers from a distance, right?
We love a good GoFundMe and being wary of strangers from a distance.
So she has to do this interview to get the cash to afford the doctors, to afford the lawyers, and afford the lawyers. Like, what are you going to do? Sue the guy? Dude was house being foreclosed on. So what do you need a lawyer for? You're not the plaintiff in a civil case. This is the state of wherever they're in versus old Nick. He committed crimes. Anyways, there's a lot of inconsistencies in this movie that I just, when I think about them, I'm like, wait,
how would we get the powerful plot point without the needing the money and the lawyer?
That's true. Yeah, I suppose that's the case. Wow. As if old Nick would stand up in the middle of the courtroom and being like, I demand shared custody. What?
I mean, it is America.
Yeah, I mean, he probably would. But like if a judge was like, you know what? He makes a good case. He is the biological father.
He
of
did
this
bring
kid.
them nice things every Sunday.
Oh yeah, he brought. He got Jack a RC car for his 5th birthday. Oh my God! I demand shared custody. I demand visitation in prison. He must come see me every Sunday. I am his father. Anyways, so she has to go on to this interview, and the interviewer is like, so are you a bad mom or the worst mom?
I like how you're not even that extreme about, you're not even that wrong about the question.
Right? I'm not, listener, if you have not seen the movie, that is pretty close. That is my Stephen Colbert impression of this interviewer asking Ma Joy these questions. And so now, all jokes aside, it's a pretty tough interview to watch as an audience member. It's a tough interview for Joy herself. And it's Grandma Joan Allen is sobbing in the background at these questions, because not only is she watching her daughter get like scarlet lettered and tomatoed in front of her, she's also the mother of the person who was abducted, and so she's having to relive that, her own trauma, right? And so it's a bad time all around, and I don't care if the interviewer is like, oh no, this is your interview. You just say, I'm not comfortable and I don't want to answer that question. Totally came in there. It felt like I was watching a Fox News interview of Joe Biden, like, I got you, buddy. And so, something bad happens. What happens, Chelsea?
Joy is obviously not doing well, as you can imagine. You go through all of this really horrible stuff. And thanks to the son, who the interviewer was basically asking, why didn't you do the quote unquote correct thing and have your captors take him to the hospital? She takes presumably a lot of, or all of, the sleeping medication that the doctor prescribed her in a suicide attempt. And Jack ends up finding her. And when Jack finds her, he's obviously very scared. The whole house ends up witnessing this. Jack is like screaming. Grandma and Grandpa end up finding Joy. 911 ends up being called. It's a very big, scary, traumatic ordeal for everybody.
Yeah, it really is. And the good news is Joy makes a recovery. And one great scene that I really loved was that one thing that we didn't mention during the development segment was that Jack believed that his hair, which is very long, had his strong in it. And of course, again, we're talking about like nouns or verbs or adjectives that are used as nouns, right? And so he finally acquiesces to Grandma, who apparently has this like gender vendetta against boys with long hair. I don't know how long I've been waiting for you to say that. Oh my God. It's like, geez, lady, give it a rest. Boys can have long hair too. So she helps him cut it off, and Grandma brings it to Joy in the hospital. I'm assuming that Joy was put on some kind of hold after her attempt to some involuntary hold Most states in the country have like a 72-hour involuntary hold after either an attempt or suspicion of an attempt. Like almost like a very heavy contemplation, I guess. And so she was probably on that, and Grandma brings her the strong, and Joy brings it out later and says, you know, I it made me really happy that you gave me your strong, because I think it did help me get better or start to get better.
That was, out of all of the scenes in this film, that was an ugly crying scene for me.
Yeah. Same.
Something about that, it just got to me.
Yeah.
Like the whole, and it was all Jack's idea. Like it wasn't Grandma's insistent, like snide comments about his long hair. It was him saying, Ma needs his strong more than him.
Yeah.
It's like just right in the feels.
Right in the feels. Yeah. And she, I think in that moment, she recognized that she, to herself, made the right choice about raising Jack in room with her. And I think that brings some closure to the guilt that she was feeling, the shame that she was feeling, and of course the added shame from the interviewer and what people might think of her watching that interview, you know, on Good Morning America or whatever. And then, or 60 Minutes, you know, one of those things. And so really sort of sweeping away that shame of that decision and just living with that decision, because she raised, for all intents and purposes, a very kind boy. And honestly,
yeah, Jack,
I would say parents all over the world really just want to raise just kind people.
Jack is he's just a great kid all around. I feel like any person would be lucky to have a kid like Jack. I know that the circumstances in which he came into being were not great. They weren't good. They were horrible. But I know that in the interview before the train wreck, like before the train went completely off the rails, when the interviewer was talking about like, oh, will you tell Jack about his father? And Joy / Ma was saying, no, he's mine. He's only mine. It's like she was very proud of him. And I think she's rightfully so. Like, she's very proud of him. And I think that she has very good reason to be proud of him. Like, he's a wonderful kid.
Yeah. And I think one thing that we can say, as we were saying with Jack's prognosis, I think the note that we leave this film on is one of hope for both of them. Mm-hmm. But in Joy's case, it is one that I think she is willing, an effort that she is willing to undertake. Like, she's not going to be like, nah, I don't need therapy. Leave me, miss me with that therapy. I think she's going to engage with it a lot more. She recognizes after her suicide attempt that she has this little boy to live for.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole "she needs my strong" was probably the icing on the cake to bring the metaphor to the very beginning of the film, making the birthday cake with him. So I think she was like, yep, I have my reason now. I have my purpose. And my purpose not only was to raise this little boy under the most dire of circumstances, but then to see him flourish.
Absolutely. I think that captures it perfectly.
And I think I'm going to end with a clip here, which is the last clip of Jacob Tremblay, of Jack, I wonder if they named him Jack because it was easier for a kid named Jacob to remember. No, I think that's his name in the book. Anyways, they go back to the scene of the crime, of course, room, and I'll leave you, audience, with this clip, and then we'll come back for the end of the episode. But one thing that you won't get in audio is what Brie Larson does at the end here, where she mouths by room. You probably won't be able to hear it, unfortunately, even if I raise the audio. She barely whispers it.
Is this room?
Yeah.
Has it gotten shrinked? Where is everything?
Taken for evidence. Proof that we were here.
It's because doors open.
What?
It can't really be a room if doors open.
Do you want me to close it?
Nah.
Jack, can we go?
Bye, plant. Bye, chair number 1. Bye, chair number 2. Bye, table. Bye, wardrobe. Bye, sink. Bye-bye, skylight. Ma, say bye-bye to room.
I want to thank Dr. Chelsea Robertson for joining me to discuss Room and Skylight. Before we say goodbye, Chelsea, is there anything that you would like to plug? Where can folks find more about your work?
Yeah, I would like to give a shout out to the East Tennessee State University Strong Brain Institute.
Excellent.
That is my alma mater for my graduate program. They are a really great group of people who are all about talking about trauma-informed care, really informing people about trauma, informing people about how we can ameliorate the effects of trauma at all age groups. If you are interested in learning more about trauma, learning more about what you can do to help people with trauma, I encourage you to Google the East Tennessee Strong Brain Institute. They have a couple of free trainings that you can do online. I strongly suggest that you go and check them out.
Excellent. I will link that in the show notes for those of you who'd like to take a look at that. So thanks again for joining me, Chelsea. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was awesome.
And that's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.